Abducted in the Mountains, the Kari Swenson story. Kari Swenson was born on June 15, 1962, in Bozeman, Montana, USA, to Bob Swenson, a professor of physics at Temple University, and Janet Swenson, a nurse. In addition to Kari, the family had two other children. It is known from sources that the Swenson family was an active, close-knit, and dedicated community. From an early age, Kari was involved in cross-country skiing and later in biathlon. By 1984, she had become a member of the U.S. women's biathlon team in the three-person relay. Her team participated in the first Women's Biathlon World Championships in Chamonix, France, where they placed third, behind only the Soviet athletes. Kari was very fond of sports, but she still planned to dedicate her life to helping small animals. Since early childhood, Kari had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Therefore, after completing her sports career, she planned to find a job at a veterinary clinic. In the spring of 1984, the girl received a diploma, University of Montana, in microbiology, and was preparing for admission to veterinary school. Kari's mother, Janet Swenson, described her daughter as a nimble and purposeful child. Only having learned to walk, the little girl could not sit still for a minute. She ran, jumped, fell and bruised, seemingly standing still. Such a tomboy girl. In the summer of 1984, after the biathlon season, Kari took a part-time job at a guest ranch near the settlement of Bugsky in the state of Montana. The girl could train there every day. Therefore, and on the morning of July 15, 1984, she went out for another run in the area of Ulleris Lakes and did not notice at all how far away from the territory of the ranch. Kari was already planning to go back when two strange men appeared out of nowhere and blocked her path. Both of them had overgrown and tangled beards, and their clothes were dirty and torn. The worst part was that they smelled very bad and had weapons in their hands. The men immediately showed that they were not at all friendly, and although Kari was quite a fighting girl, these two managed to attack her, tie her hands, and force her to go with them. Now we will go back a little and get to know the kidnappers of the girl. 53-year-old Don Nichols and his 19-year-old son Dan have been living in the mountains for several years. Don was once married to Dan's mother. However, they divorced when Dan was 4 years old, and for a while Dan lived with his mother and only visited his father during the holidays. Eventually, Dan moved in with his father, and they left the civilized world together. Don Nichols always believed that people were not worthy to live on this planet. In his opinion, the population had so much polluted it that he simply disowned humanity and went to live in the mountains. Together with his son, the man wandered from one natural zone to another, living in tents and getting food from the wildlife. But everything would be fine. They lived like mountain people and live. The problem was that the older Dan got, the more he needed to interact with the opposite sex. His father understood this as well. As a result, they occasionally went on, quote, hunting trips for a bride. The men believed that over time, any girl would come to accept her fate and become a model homemaker in their family. When Don and Dan captured Kari, they took her to their camp, where they forced her to climb into a sleeping bag at gunpoint. Afterward, the older man chained Kari, who was still in the sleeping bag, to a tree and ordered his son to guard her. Don went into the woods to gather firewood, and a conversation took place between the, quote, groom and bride. Kari tried to engage Dan in conversation, and at one point she even managed to appeal to his compassion. But the guy quickly came to his senses and said to the girl, "You're pretty. I'll leave you here after all." Soon, the head of the family returned and asked Kari to be patient for a few days. He believed that she would quickly get used to this lifestyle and even start to enjoy it. Don also said that if Kari wanted to live, she had to keep quiet. If she didn't listen and started screaming, her potential rescuers would die. Meanwhile, by the evening of the same day, the owner of the ranch, Bob Schaap, realized that Kari had not returned to the base, and he became seriously concerned. He knew that a bear had recently been spotted near the ranch. Therefore, he assumed that Kari had become a victim of the predator. The girl's friends, Alan Goldstein and Jim Schwalbe, alerted Kari's parents about her disappearance and set out on their own search on the morning of July 16, 1984. The young men shouted Kari's name and then listened for about a minute for a response. And when they moved away from the ranch a few hundred meters, the girl tied to the tree heard the call of her friends. She began to shout back at them. Kari desperately tried to warn them not to get closer, as there were people with guns near her. And in the meantime, the panicked Dan and Don tried to silence the girl. While 19-year-old Dan was covering Kari's mouth with his hand, 53-year-old Don pulled out his gun and prepared to meet the guests. Kari managed to throw off Dan's hand and screamed again. In response, Dan shot her in the chest. Just then, Alan and Jim arrived at the camp. As they approached, Don fired several shots at Alan Goldstein, who rushed to Kari's aid. Jim was standing a little way off at the time, so knowing that he could not defeat the enemy with his bare hands, he rushed to get help. And father and son packed their things, left the dead Alan and the dying Kari, untied her from the tree and disappeared into the forest. Kari managed to wait for rescue for 4 hours. The girl was lucky because the bullet went out, entering through the chest, passing through the lung, and coming out under the shoulder blade. And being a trained athlete, Kari understood that she needed to breathe properly in order to wait for help and not to increase the bleeding. After 4 hours, rescuers reached the injured Kari Swenson and took her by helicopter to the road where a car was waiting for her. Once in the hospital, Kari received the necessary care and began to recover. Meanwhile, the investigation was focused on finding the mountain men, as they were called in the press. It's worth noting that at the time, journalists had romanticized the image of the perpetrators. Hundreds of thousands of people were eager to see these mythical mountain men. However, Kari and her parents were angered by the romanticization of the tragedy. In the eyes of society, Kari was a beauty, while the Nicholses were portrayed as monsters. It was like a fairy tale. The Nichols father and son were only apprehended in December 1984. They were discovered by a rancher who noticed smoke from a campfire in the mountains. The police arrived at the reported location and found Dan and Don, who were badly beaten and starving. At the time, it seemed that they were even happy to be caught. At the trial, Dan claimed that he had accidentally pulled the trigger in a state of shock. However, this contradicted the testimony of Kari Swenson. Despite this, Dan Nichols was sentenced to 10 years in prison in May 1985. In 1991, he was released on parole, and he did not come to the attention of law enforcement agencies until 2001, when he was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison for possession of illegal substances. After his release, he found employment as a counseling psychologist for individuals with mental health issues. He later married a 24-year-old woman named Liz and revealed to a media outlet that he had not spoken to his father since his release. According to Dan, his father called him a traitor for returning to a civilized life. Don Nichols was sentenced to 85 years in prison for kidnapping, murder, and aggravated assault. According to the prosecution, he was the mastermind behind the events and had a significant impact on his son's mental state. Don applied for parole 4 times, and each time the Swenson family opposed his release. But on the 4th time, when the man was already 86 years old, he was released after 32 years of imprisonment on August 23, 2017. The man was able to hold on to freedom for a little less than 6 years and died on June 17, 2023. After the girl was discharged from the hospital, Kari returned to training and was again included in the U.S. biathlon team. In 1986, she participated in the biathlon competition in Oslo, Norway, where she took 4th place. And immediately after that, Kari ended her sports career. As the girl had planned, she entered the veterinary school of the University of State Colorado, and in 1990, got a job at a veterinary clinic for small animals in the district's Steamboat Springs, all in the same state. In 1995, she returned to her home state of Montana and took a job as a veterinarian at a clinic in the town of Bozeman. Biathlon still plays a significant role in Kari's life as she continues to train for herself and coaches children in her free time. In 1987, the film The Kidnapping of Kari Swenson was released. If you're interested in this story, you can watch the film. It's an older movie, but it's still worth watching.